I used to think burnout came from doing too much, but the Stoics taught me that it comes from doing too much of what doesn't matter, from being pulled in 100 directions without clarity, purpose, or control. Seneca's words hit hardest when I read them through trembling hands. It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste much of it. And in that moment I saw the truth not just about time, but about energy, attention, and meaning. Burnout doesn't begin with the body, it begins in the mind. When we lose the distinction between what is essential and what is noise, when we try to control everything, please everyone, and live up to expectations we never questioned in the first place. The Stoics knew this trap well, which is why they urged constant reflection, clarity of purpose, and detachment from results. Epictetus taught that what we truly control is limited to our thoughts, actions, and intentions. Everything else, from outcomes to opinions, must be let go if we want peace. But I hadn't let go. I was gripping harder, working longer, pushing through fatigue with pride and fear until I collapsed into exhaustion. Not from the weight of the world, but from the weight of trying to hold what was never mine. Stoicism gave me the language I didn't know I needed, the language of limits, of reasoned choice, of deliberate no's in a world of endless yeses. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If you seek tranquility, do less, or more accurately, do what's essential," which brings a double satisfaction. To do less, better. And I began to reshape my life one choice at a time, cutting what didn't serve my purpose, simplifying what once overwhelmed me, and learning to value rest not as weakness but as wisdom. The Stoics weren't detached from life. They were fully present in it, but only for what aligned with virtue, what could be done with excellence, and what truly mattered. Burnout fades when boundaries return, when stillness is honored, and when the mind stops trying to win every battle and starts choosing the right ones. And that's how the Stoic path saved me. Not by changing the world, but by teaching me to meet it with less noise, more strength, and finally peace. The Stoics understood that unchecked obligation is a path to exhaustion, not honor, and that a life lived to satisfy everyone's expectations leads not to peace but to fragmentation. Because the more we say yes to everything, the more we dilute our purpose, drain our attention, and forget who we are. Seneca wrote that we must learn to say no without guilt, to conserve ourselves for the things that serve the soul, not just the schedule. And in a world where worth is often measured by productivity, it takes courage to pause, to step back, and to protect your time like your life depends on it, because it does. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily to guard his morning thoughts, to keep the mind from being hijacked by demands, distractions, or imagined urgencies, and that discipline is what preserves sanity in a life full of noise. Burnout is not just physical, it is the soul screaming from being spread too thin across tasks, requests, and responsibilities that were never aligned with our deepest values. Epictetus advised that we examine each obligation with the question, is this within my control? Does this serve my reason or only my reputation? And this is not selfishness, but sanity, the reclaiming of our energy for what truly matters. The Stoic life is not passive withdrawal, but intentional engagement, the quiet power of someone who chooses carefully and acts decisively rather than reacting to every knock at the door. The moment we begin to practice boundaries, we are no longer overwhelmed servants of the world. We become calm governors of our time, our efforts, and our mind. Saying no does not make you cold or lazy. It makes you wise enough to choose what you'll give your limited strength to, and strong enough to endure the discomfort of disappointing others for the sake of not disappointing yourself. The Stoic remembers that every yes is also a no to something else, usually to rest, clarity, or personal progress, and so they speak with precision, act with purpose, and do less better. And in doing so, they free themselves from the prison of pleasing everyone and step into the rare power of pleasing only what is reasonable, meaningful, and aligned with the path of virtue. To a mind governed by ego, rest looks like failure, like falling behind, like weakness. But to the Stoic, rest is not indulgence but strategy, not avoidance but a return to balance, because the mind, like a bow, loses its strength if always kept taut. Seneca warned that the mind must be allowed leisure, not to indulge in laziness but to refresh itself, to breathe, to prepare for meaningful labor. And in a world that glorifies hustle, this wisdom is more radical than ever. Burnout thrives in a body that is pushed beyond reason and a mind that is never allowed silence, and it begins to wither the moment one chooses deliberate stillness, not idleness, but true recovery, where nothing is demanded and everything is observed. The Stoic does not see rest as a threat to discipline, but as a partner to it, understanding that a sharpened sword must be sheathed to remain useful, and a warrior who never rests becomes a danger to himself. Marcus Aurelius, emperor of Rome, paused each morning to reflect, not because he had spare time, but because he knew that even amid wars and politics, the soul must be tended or it will revolt. Rest to the Stoic is sacred, not because it feels good, but because it returns the mind to clarity. It resets the lens through which we see life, and it breaks the illusion that constant motion equals progress. Epictetus taught that we must not be swept up in the movements of others, but must stand still and choose our own. And sometimes the wisest choice is to sit, to stop, to let the dust settle. The Stoic does not glorify exhaustion. They observe it as a signal, a teacher, a boundary line between reason and ruin. And when they cross that line too often, they do not shame themselves, they adjust. Burnout loses its grip the moment we stop seeing stillness as a sin and start seeing it as strength. And when rest is no longer framed as retreat but as reinforcement, the mind begins to heal and the body begins to trust itself again. And in that space, quiet but strong, the Stoic rises. Not because they pushed harder, but because they finally knew when to pause. The Stoic knows that burnout is not only caused by what we do, but by what we tell ourselves about what we do. Because the voice in our head becomes the weight on our back. And if that voice is harsh, relentless, and never satisfied, it will wear down the strongest spirit. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his journal not to appear wise to others, but to remind himself that his worth was not in outcomes, but in effort, that peace is not granted by success, but chosen through judgment. And when the inner dialogue is poisoned by guilt, fear, or impossible standards, no amount of rest or accomplishment will save us. Epictetus reminded his students that we are disturbed not by things, but by our opinions of things. And when we believe we are failing, when we call ourselves lazy for slowing down, when we measure our value only by productivity, we create the very suffering we want to escape. Burnout often begins when the inner voice becomes a tyrant, demanding more, criticizing always, and mocking any sign of fatigue as weakness. But the Stoic steps in with reason and says, "I have done what is in my control, nothing more is owed." This practice of inner correction is a form of discipline, not indulgence, and it transforms the mind from an enemy to an ally, teaching it to speak with clarity and compassion instead of cruelty. The Stoic doesn't drown in negative thoughts. They confront them like faulty arguments, test them, challenge them, and replace them with what is true. That rest is necessary, that failure is a teacher, that the self is worthy even in stillness. Seneca wrote that a man who has peace within is never truly disturbed by the world outside, and that peace begins by silencing the lie that we must always do more to be enough. The Stoic voice says, "You are not your schedule, you are not your performance, you are your choices, your values, your effort." And with that shift, the spiral of burnout begins to loosen its grip. When the mind becomes an inner refuge instead of a battlefield, healing accelerates and clarity returns. And we begin to live not under the pressure of perfection, but under the guidance of reason. One of the most powerful but overlooked pieces of Stoic advice is the courage to stop and ask, is the life I've built truly aligned with what I value? Because burnout is not just the result of overwork, but of misalignment, of spending your days serving priorities that do not nourish the soul. And the Stoics were relentless in reminding us that a good life is not about appearances, but about inner harmony. Seneca advised Lucilius to take inventory of how he spent each day, warning that many men lose their lives not to one great tragedy, but to small, unnoticed distractions that slowly steal the time meant for philosophy, reflection, and the pursuit of virtue. Marcus Aurelius wrote that people are often drawn toward what is popular rather than what is right, and they wake one day to find themselves exhausted by the pursuit of goals they never truly believed in. The Stoic dares to reorder life, not for comfort but for clarity, choosing fewer but more meaningful responsibilities, eliminating what is unnecessary, and drawing a new line between obligation and choice. This requires honesty because it means acknowledging that some commitments may look admirable but are secretly draining, that some relationships may appear supportive but are quietly eroding the soul, and that some habits, though socially praised, lead nowhere we want to go. The Stoic does not act out of guilt, pressure, or fear of judgment. They act from principle, and if that means stepping back from roles, reputations, or routines that no longer fit, they do so with calm resolve. Epictetus reminded his students that progress sometimes looks like subtraction, not addition, and that saying no to what no longer serves you is not failure, it is refinement. To reorder life is not to run from it, but to rebuild it in alignment with the soul, with virtue, with reason, and with a deep sense that each day should reflect who we wish to become. And as we remove what is false, what is forced, and what is excessive, burnout begins to dissolve, not through escape, but through the steady recentering of a life that finally fits the soul that lives within it. The Stoic does not chase praise, for they understand that to live by the approval of others is to hand over your peace to strangers. And when every task is fueled by the desire to be noticed, rewarded, or applauded, the result is not fulfillment, but exhaustion. A burnout rooted in performance rather than purpose. Seneca wrote that the wise man is content with being good, not appearing good, and in this distinction lies the key to a life that is internally driven rather than externally drained. Marcus Aurelius asked himself often, am I doing this for myself, for the common good, or for applause? And when the answer pointed toward vanity or ego, he redirected his focus to the work itself, reminding himself that virtue needs no witnesses to be real. Burnout is magnified when our efforts are tethered to how they are received, when we check results before reflecting on effort, and when we base our worth on metrics we do not control. But the Stoic releases that chain, anchoring their value in the integrity of their action, knowing that the right thing remains right even when unseen, unpraised, or misunderstood. Epictetus taught that we should seek to be rather than to seem, and the one who internalizes this teaching finds freedom from the emotional roller coaster of validation. The Stoic does not perform, they practice, they refine, they aim for excellence not because of applause, but because their standard comes from within. And when others misunderstand them, ignore them, or even criticize them, they do not falter because they are not working for the crowd. They are working for their character. In a world obsessed with performance, this quiet commitment is revolutionary, and it lifts the weight of trying to please everyone, of chasing impossible standards, and of burning out under the heat of perpetual performance. The Stoic replaces external reward with internal clarity, and in doing so they rediscover joy not in outcome but in integrity, in doing what is right for its own sake. And when this becomes the rhythm of life, burnout loses its grip because the soul no longer begs to be seen. It simply chooses to be quietly and powerfully aligned with virtue. The Stoic does not measure success by accumulation, but by sufficiency, by the quiet question, is what I have enough for the life I want to live with virtue? Because burnout is often not the product of necessity, but of insatiability, of chasing more without ever defining what more is for. Seneca warned that wealth and success without self-restraint are just new chains, distractions dressed in luxury, and the man who never feels he has enough will never know rest, even on the softest bed. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that if he could act justly, speak truthfully, and live according to nature, then nothing else was truly needed. Because enough is not a number, it is a mindset, and the Stoic sharpens that mindset like a blade against the stone of discipline. In a world that worships ambition and celebrates overwork, it takes courage to say, "This is sufficient. I can stop here. I can be content, not complacent, but clear that my peace matters more than endless striving." Burnout accelerates when we ignore this, when we pursue promotions we don't need, or commitments that impress but exhaust, or standards that come not from reason but comparison. The Stoic asks not how much more they can get, but how much they can live without, and still remain upright, peaceful, and free. Epictetus urged his students to examine every desire and ask, "What will I have to give up for this?" Because every yes to more is a no to rest, to presence, to clarity, and the wise man weighs that cost before he acts. Enough is not mediocrity. It is wisdom refined, the ability to stop accumulating, stop overreaching, and start enjoying the simplicity of a life that fits its owner. When we redefine enough as peace, virtue, presence, and self-command, the burden of burnout begins to fall away, replaced by a quiet steadiness, a contentment that is not loud but lasting. The Stoic does not stop growing. They simply grow inward, deeper rather than wider, stronger rather than louder. And in that way they protect their energy, their mind, and their soul from the endless fire of more that consumes so many before they ever truly begin to live. The Stoic carve space into their life not by accident but by discipline, understanding that stillness is not the absence of movement. It is the mastery of movement, the calm in which wisdom can be heard and peace can grow. And without it, even the strongest person will be broken down by the noise of the world. Marcus Aurelius retreated not to mountains or temples, but to the silence within his own mind, and reminded himself, nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul. And this retreat was not escape, but preparation, not withdrawal, but a sharpening of the inner edge. Burnout thrives where there is no pause, where the day begins in haste and ends in depletion, where one's schedule is filled with doing but starved of being. But the Stoic does not let the external pace define their internal state. They begin the day not with panic but with principle, returning again and again to stillness as a form of strength. Epictetus said that we must train our thoughts like soldiers, not let them run wild, and that discipline begins in stillness, where we face ourselves without distraction, without excuses, and without judgment. The world will always demand more, but the Stoic practices stepping back, not as surrender, but as command, the deliberate act of reclaiming space to breathe, to reflect, and to remember what matters most. Stillness is where insight is born, where the soul recalibrates and where burnout loses its grip. Not because life becomes easier, but because our mind becomes clearer. It is in stillness that the Stoic remembers their priorities, recognizes their patterns, and redirects their energy with precision. It is not passive, it is powerful, a return to center that makes all further action meaningful. Without stillness, the Stoic knows they are just reacting, not choosing, and action without reflection is the fastest path to emptiness. But with stillness, they regain authorship of their days, of their thoughts, of their choices, and they rise, not frantic but grounded, not loud but certain. And in this quiet, consistent practice, the burnout fades, not all at once, but surely steadily, replaced by a life built not on momentum alone, but on mastery from within. The Stoic endures not because they are cold or unfeeling, but because they have mastered the art of detachment, the ability to hold life with open hands, knowing that anything can be taken but virtue, and it is this detachment that shields the mind from crumbling when circumstances turn against us. Epictetus taught that we must love but not cling, strive but not depend, and work but not identify with the outcome, because burnout often hides beneath the illusion of control. Control beneath the desperate need for things to go our way. And when they don't, we collapse, not from failure but from false expectations. Detachment is not disengagement. It is deep engagement with the right things, with our responses, our intentions, and our values, rather than with outcomes, opinions, or results we can't command. Marcus Aurelius ruled the greatest empire of his time, yet he reminded himself daily to let go of vanity, of reputation, of the illusion that he controlled the future, because the only thing truly his was the present moment and the principles he chose to live by. Burnout loosens its grip when we release the obsession with doing everything perfectly, being everything to everyone and controlling every result. When we instead focus on showing up with clarity and allowing the rest to unfold as it will. The Stoic endures because they do not take failure personally, do not take success too seriously, and do not take hardship as an injustice. They take all things as part of nature, to be met with reason, not resistance. Detachment is how we stay grounded when the storms come, how we remain whole when what we love is threatened, and how we stay energized when others crumble under the weight of expectation. The Stoic lives fully but not fearfully, loving deeply but accepting change, striving with discipline but letting go of the result. And in this balance they find endurance, not temporary motivation but lasting resilience. Burnout fades when life is no longer clutched but carried lightly, and the Stoic walks forward with open hands, unburdened, because they have finally detached from the chaos and reattached to what no circumstance can steal: wisdom, integrity, and the inner calm of a mind aligned with nature. Burnout ends not when life becomes easy, but when the self becomes whole again, when the soul is no longer ignored in pursuit of schedules, and the Stoic path brings us back not to a better to-do list, but to a better version of ourselves, one aligned with reason, anchored in values, and no longer fragmented by the noise of a world that never stops demanding. Marcus Aurelius, despite being emperor, used his private writings not to rule others, but to rule himself, reminding his soul to be upright, restrained, and aligned with nature, because he knew that peace could not be found in the external world. It had to be returned to again and again from within. Epictetus told his students that freedom is found in self-governance, in mastering desires, calming fears, and choosing our own judgments rather than inheriting the noisy values of the crowd. Burnout fades when we stop asking, "What should I do next?" and start asking, "Who do I want to be right now?" Because when the self becomes the source of direction, no demand can pull us too far from center. The Stoic practice is a return, not to a new version of the world, but to the self we lost while trying to keep up with it. In the quiet moments, in stillness, in reflection, the Stoic reconnects with the principles that make life worth living: courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom. And from those roots, they rise again, not with urgency, but with quiet confidence. Burnout was never just about the workload. It was about the misalignment, the forgetting, the giving away of time, energy, and identity to things that never deserved them. The Stoic reclaims all of that, piece by piece, breath by breath, until the self returns not as ego, but as presence, calm and quiet strength. And when that return is complete, when the soul is no longer hiding beneath obligation or exhaustion, the Stoic rises, not because they've escaped pressure, but because they've remembered who they are beneath it, and in that return they find what no system, achievement, or schedule can give them: a life of peace, guided from within, immune to burnout because it no longer burns for what was never theirs to carry.